And so as we can kind of see, we have Spanish interpretation available. And so for folks who would like to listen in Spanish, please just select the interpret button on the bottom right of your screen.
Tenemos interpretación en español simultánea. Después de esta introducción, por favor, para escoger interpretación, vayan a la pantalla, abajo a la derecha, en el globito o 3 puntitos, escoja interpretación, luego español y luego picarle en done o finalizar.
And so a PDF of the slides will be mailed out following the training. So don't worry about that. We'll email that to all the registrants. And sorry.
I can continue now simultaneous since we said how to get that.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. So yeah, we'll email those PDFs out after we finish today's training. We'll have an evaluation at the end, so please don't forget to fill that out. And then we want to make sure everyone understands also that this webinar is recorded. I think we already clicked that record button. You probably had an option to click OK on that, but we want to make sure everyone is aware of that. Cool. And so then just to introduce ourselves, so we have 2 facilitators for today. So my name is Marley Mayon. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm one of the sexual violence response coordinators here at the Coalition. And then I'll turn it over to Lizette to introduce herself.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us. My name is Lizette Roeder, and my pronouns are she, her, ella, and I am the one of the domestic violence response coordinators at the Coalition.
Awesome. So just some of the objectives that we have today. So we're going to first kind of identify components of a strong virtual safety plan, identify best practices for virtual support groups. So a lot of this really is from that framework of the virtual setting.
Could you go a little?
Yeah. Go a little bit slower. Absolutely. So like I said, we'll learn the components of a strong virtual safety plan, identify those best practices for a virtual support group. We will learn how to provide active listening in a virtual setting. We're going to understand and kind of recognize tech and Zoom fatigue. We will identify comparative suffering and understand what that is and how that plays out in our role as advocates. And then we'll understand the stages of burnout. And we'll kind of wrap all of that up with an activity on self-care for us to kind of use for our future selves. And so, yeah, those are the objectives for today. So then if you've been to an ACES DV training before, or especially in this last year where we get creative with the virtual space, we're going to be using a Mentimeter to get us started. So go ahead. I think we'll share this information in the chat as well. But if you want to head to menti.com and put in the code 46027364, we're going to start with a little bit of an interactive activity. So let me just pull that up quick. Oops. All right, so the first question we have here for the Menti, for folks who can see it, it says, what virtual platforms have you used in the last year? So we're going to be talking about kind of best practices in the virtual space, what we've learned. And so we want to hear from you all. What are those platforms you all have used in this last year? Cool, we see them coming in. So we have Zoom, Microsoft Teams. Yeah. Awesome. Yeah, keep including those. And the ones that kind of we see a lot of folks sharing will be the larger ones kind of that we see especially. So we see like Zoom's fairly big, Teams, Google Meets, Marco Polo, Instagram. What else? We see Skype, WebEx, Google Docs, WhatsApp. all sorts of virtual platforms, right? And so for this is in part for us to kind of understand all the different platforms we've really had to maybe refamiliarize or better familiarize ourselves with in this last year, just to have that understanding of our own learning and especially how that impacts the clients we're serving in terms of the learning and learning curve that they have had. Thank you all for sharing. So I'm going to move on to our next question, kind of transitioning us back to this role of the advocate. What does it mean to be an advocate? So we really want to approach this training with understanding all the efforts folks have put in this last year, whether or not advocates in your title or not. I'm curious to hear from you all, what does it mean to be an advocate? So if you're explaining kind of the work that you do as a victim service provider to your friends, to your family, what are some of those details that you're sharing with folks? Yeah, so some of the messages we have coming in, active listening, support, a listening ear, empathy, resourceful, it looks like that one's coming up a lot, active listening. It looks like I have some folks in the chat, and I encourage folks who want to share with everyone to click everyone. We have provide services, support and advocacy to survivors and family, formative, flexible, find resources, assist, a shoulder. I just want to read a few more of these. Sorry, they're moving fast for me. Find resources, provide options. Yeah, so I think we can all agree there's a lot that goes into being an advocate, right? This is a lengthy list, and we see some of those larger ones really coming out of support, empower, resources, empathy. And so this is really to ground us in understanding all the work that you all do as advocates, all the responsibilities you all have. We're going to talk about things like burnout and self-care. And I think when we have so many of these varied responsibilities that are so important, you know, having that burnout and being prepared for that makes sense. So I just, like I said, want us to ground us in understanding all that we do as advocates. And then one more, what advocacy services does your organization offer? And some of this might be things you listed in the last one. But I want to hear from you all, what advocacy services does your organization offer? So some that we have coming in include therapy, resources, support group, counseling, legal referrals, case management, lay legal, therapy, court advocacy, food, right? There's such a variety of things that we offer. What else do we have? Youth counseling, funds for legal fees, help with orders of protection. Exactly, there's so much. So not only do we do so much as advocates, but the services that our organizations provide that perhaps we assist with specifically, there are a lot of them, right? And so I think that context is really important to understanding the need for self-care, why burnout is so prevalent, and especially how transitioning to this virtual setting perhaps increases just the struggle in making those services accessible, and you know the ways that advocates have to be creative in providing those resources. Thank you all for sharing. So I'm going to turn that off and go back to the presentation here. So just to kind of reiterate some of the things we talked about, The role of an advocate, I really think of as being this kind of ultimate kind of connector, right? So as advocates, we're connecting the dots, connecting the resources. And I thought that this visual was kind of helpful. So some folks talked about providing case management. Perhaps that's a dot that we're connecting. Another dot might be those lay legal services, right? Another dot could be any one of those things that folks included in the chat, right? Whether it's providing food, providing support group information, providing those healing services. As we kind of saw in the Menti, there's a lot of responsibilities and things that we do here as advocates. And so I think, this isn't the best visual, I just kind of came up with this, but I think really looking at ourselves as this connector and the role of that, I think is something that I think we take seriously. And so what we're going to talk about today is how are we making those connections and understanding our role as an advocate in this virtual space, and providing those connections accordingly. I hope that kind of makes sense and that visual is helpful for folks. So I'm actually going to stop sharing and turn it over to Lizette for this next part.
Thank you, Marley. All right, everyone, so let's talk safety. So one of the first things we need to consider as we continue to provide virtual services, both for new and existing clients, survivors, is safety. As advocates, we understand that safety is different for every single survivor, and it's multifaceted. But things are changing so very quickly, especially within this last year. So sometimes it can be easy for us to forget or even place a little bit of less importance in one of the many facets. So while this is not going to be a whole robust 20-hour safety plan session, we are going to go over some of the important facets that we should continue to emphasize and revise with our survivors. So the following components should be considered as a part of creating a robust virtual safety plan: routines, methods of contact, privacy and availability, types of devices being used, frequently used applications, emotional safety, access to support networks, and COVID-19 specific health tips. So let's begin with methods of contact. And with methods of contact, I wanted to break it up into survivors that are new to services and survivors that are continuing services. For survivors that are new to services, it should be clear that the survivor has the ability to choose whether or not the program will continue contact and offer services. It is also important that they understand that they are the ones who will let us know what form of contact they would prefer: email, text, phone call. However, that being said, if the survivor offers a platform that they are used to but is not being used by your agency, make sure that you have that conversation with the survivor. Make sure that you're not coming from a judgmental place, but let them know that you have certain protocols, policies, and platforms that you've already vetted in order to continue offering them the most privacy and safety possible. With that being said, be prepared to explain your program's capacity and confidentiality obligations. Make sure that you're including these protocols to help the survivor make informed choices about each of the platforms or forms of contact that they choose. This will also allow them to really think about how much of that information they are storing, in what devices they are using, as well as how much your agency is storing and how you're getting rid of that sensitive data. Remember that being uncomfortable with technology does not equate being bad at it. Just because they're not comfortable with Docsy or Zoom or let's see what else, Blue Jeans, does not mean that they are bad with all technology. As with everything, it's new and there's going to be a learning curve. But for you to give them those choices and to give them that ability to consent to the type of services they want is going to immediately give you that rapport and allow you to continue the best virtual services that you can. So what about survivors continuing services? Because we do have some survivors that have been in the program prior to when we went into lockdown and the new normal became all virtual, right? So with COVID mandates being lifted, people are once again on the go. So don't assume that the current methods that you've been using over this last year are still going to be okay. Ask if changes need to be made, especially because for many survivors, they are now becoming employed again or have different jobs. And now they have their kids out of school. So that's something very important to keep in mind. Offer updates in a timely manner. Because things are changing, that means that our agencies are going to start having soft open dates, maybe a few in-person groups, maybe a few in-person services. If this is the case and your availability is going to change, it is important that you offer that update in a timely manner because it's not just your schedule that's changing, it's their schedule that's changing. And if they're really wanting to continue services, you're going to want to give them all the options possible. If using a method for the first time, familiarize yourself with the basic settings. That goes for both the survivor and the advocate, right? Make sure that, make it like a learning experience, make it an activity for both you and the survivor. Do you know how to send the chat? Do you know how to mute? Do you know how to share your video? Do you know where you can go in and remove permissions to store data? All of those things might seem like common sense, but every single platform is different. And the other thing we must keep in mind is that platforms sometimes change the settings or revert when there are software updates. So just something to keep in mind. Let's switch over to privacy and availability. As I already said, and you're actually going to hear me say a few times, the world is ever changing and so is our availability. We still need to be mindful of shared spaces. We, the advocates and allies, are not the only ones that are sharing a space with our cats, our dogs, our kids, or a significant other. Make sure that every time that you are offering a virtual service, whether it's a one-on-one emotional support, that your conversation begins by, are you in a safe or private space? Is this still a good time to talk? Make sure that you are aware if it is not a good time to talk and follow up with them accordingly based on what the survivor has asked you to use for that form of contact. Think of what trails are being left behind that could reveal the survivor seeking help. This is very important. Part of offering virtual services is that if we do not think about privacy and availability, we might leave a trail that could compromise personal safety, loss of privacy, and confidentiality. Personal safety. If we're communicating via text or with emails or even on a chat, there's a possibility that it could be compromised. For example, a video call could be automatically stored in the call history. So make sure that you're aware of what is being stored. Loss of privacy. Beyond the risk up to personal safety, a survivor may also have their message threads read. If someone sees them, if they're in the room with them, if they can see over their shoulder, they're seeing this content without consent. And it could jeopardize how and what services the survivor is receiving. And confidentiality. So when advocates use mobile devices to communicate with survivors, we need to make sure that we're letting them know, or to the best of our abilities, what policies and practices our agency holds to be able to ensure that their messages are not being read, that our phones aren't being picked up, or that our computers are safe and have our password protected. So once again, this is really about letting them know and communicating with them what services are available and how we take care of their privacy, but also that their availability is something that's important to us. Let's talk about devices and apps. We want to make sure that we're helping survivors make informed choices about their devices and their apps. If you know what devices and what apps they like to frequent, maybe they're like me and when they get frustrated after something, they take a TikTok break, right? Or maybe they go on Instagram. What privacy and safety features does that app have? Those apps that they're frequenting on a daily basis. If you're familiar with that, then maybe together you can find how to ensure that the safety settings and the privacy settings are to their liking and will offer the most safety for the survivor and also for their family, right? Because here's the thing, when we're talking about devices and apps, think of how many times a survivor hands the phone over to their kid to keep them entertained or busy while they're trying to take care of business, setting up appointments, right? So if the kiddos have access, the kiddos are not going to be going in and changing privacy settings, right? So we want to make sure that we do think of that. Remember that plain language equals informed consent. Have you ever read the privacy agreement for like Apple? It's most of us scroll, right? And hit, okay, I agree. What did we just agree to? When it comes to the platforms that you use and to the services that you offer virtually, make sure that you're explaining it in a manner that is going to be simple to understand, not because we don't assume that the survivor will not be able to grasp something more complicated, but because we also want to ensure that everyone across the board is getting the same simple information. Collect minimal data and don't keep it forever. None of us with work phones should be keeping conversations that we're having with our survivors forever and a day, right? We want to make sure that we're following the policies and the procedures of our agency, and we want to make sure that we're minimizing that loss of potential data to the wrong hands. If the survivor is collecting evidence of the abuse, you might consider asking them to use Docusafe. So Docusafe is a free app that helps survivors collect, store, and share evidence of the abuse. Survivors can document abuse by logging individual incidents, including any photos, screenshots, documentation of threatening messages, harassing social media posts, and unwanted repeated phone calls. And the app is going to ask for a PIN, and it is vetted through NNEDV. So I highly recommend that you read into it and see if this is an option for your survivors. So I'm going to put the link to Docusafe into the chat right now for everyone. And there you go. And last but not least, discuss opting out of sharing data in apps, and not just in apps, but also in places where you are paying online bills and your banks. All banking institutions should allow you to opt out of sharing data with third parties, but they're not going to offer that to you. You have to go in and you have to ask. Legally, they have to give you that option. And now a lot of the apps are doing the same. When I can't sleep, yeah, this is not a proud moment, but I'm still playing Candy Crush. And just recently, 2 weeks ago, it asked me, do you want to opt out of sharing data? So what you're going to start seeing is a lot of apps are going to be offering this. And it's very important to discuss with survivors why it's a good idea to opt out. Just remember that all tools have risks, and advocates should be able to talk about those relevant risks with survivors. We're not experts by any means. If you asked me to talk to a survivor about, the risks with Snapchat, I would have no idea. I'd probably ask my daughter first, right? But I can still read up. I can grasp the basics, and I can have that conversation and learn with a survivor. We don't have to be, a walking, living Google. Don't create fear or shame around technology. All of this talking about opting out and potential data breaches, it can create a fear. However, just remember that that's completely unfair, because think of everything that we have to do with technology nowadays. So creating a fear around it or creating a shame for using it, even for as a form of self-care, is not our place as advocates. Let's talk about a few other things we should consider as we are safety planning and offering virtual services. Language translation. It is very important to be mindful of machine-based translations when communicating with our survivors. Google did not go to a specialized trauma and informed terminology class. All right, they didn't get any CLE or any other whatever learning units you acquire. Sensitivity of tone is also not going to be apparent from a machine translation. If you are a bilingual advocate and you are using the multiple keyboards on your phone, just make sure that before you hit send, that you are looking at what you're sending and that you have chosen the words that to your best of knowledge are a little bit more trauma informed, definitely trauma informed and a little bit more specialized. And make sure that once again, you are watching out for that sensitivity of tone, especially when safety planning, right? Because we don't want to put a survivor into a mindset of crisis or that something is definitely wrong and this is why we are safety planning right now. Instead, safety planning is something that should always occur and we're just updating your plan. That is all. And along with that, just remember that body language and tone of voice can be used to convey a lack of privacy, safety, and the emotional state of the survivor. Listen and observe, especially if you're offering video teleservices, right? So video chat or video conference. Do they seem really stiff? Do they seem a little bit more quiet? Do they seem like they don't want to share as much? That could be a sign that the harm doer is there or that people are there that do not know about them receiving services, which is once again why it's important that we begin every session with, are you in a good place? Are you in a safe place? Can we still talk right now? And then let's talk about emotional safety. Emotional safety is very important. In the movement to end violence, there's often a great deal of emphasis around physical safety. And while that is very important, it is very important that we also considered emotional well-being as part of a safety plan. As with physical safety, just remember that it looks different from one survivor to the next, and it's ultimately about developing a personalized plan that helps survivors cope with and express their emotions. So for this part, I like to think of it as a plot of land because it's a holistic approach, right? When I was in direct services and working with teens, I would always talk about emotional safety as a plot of land. So now I want everyone to kind of think, you just have this plot of land. You inherited it, you bought it, it's been in the family. All right, so this plot of land is going to be where you plant and gather resources that are going to make your life better, which is why it's important to make a plan on how to care for that land. Is that land always going to need the same type of care? So you can put in the chat, do you think that you're going to use the same type of care between drought and a season with lots of rain, frost, or plague? Are you going to plant something if it's not the season for that particular plant? Are you going to sell everything on that plot of land, even if you know that you have to keep some to keep that land going? Hopefully the answers are no, right? Because that plot of land is going to need different types of care depending on what the conditions exactly, different conditions, different needs, different strategies. And that's exactly what it is with emotional safety. Emotional safety is really going to depend on the condition, the needs, and the different strategies of everyone. Because while yoga may work for one survivor, poetry might work for the next. So a few ways to think about emotional safety. Do you know what activates you? Do you know what are some of the things that you can avoid? Whether it's on TV or certain shows I will not watch, certain books I will not read, certain songs that remind me of a bad time in my life. What can I actively avoid? what are your warning signs? Or what are the signs that something's not feeling right emotionally, right? I always share with people that when I'm particularly overwhelmed and I've been activated as a survivor advocate, I feel that my house is really dirty, even when it's clean. So I panic and I start scrubbing the floor. And to me, that's a sign that I need to take a step back, take a deep breath, and go to my support network and say, I'm not doing okay. Seek safe and supportive people, just like I do, right? People you can talk to about your feelings. What are you currently feeling? Is it safe for you to talk to them about it? Make your environment or find a space that is calm and peaceful. For some people, this might be getting in the shower, right? For some people, it might be getting into bed with a big heavy blanket and turning off the lights. Identify coping strategies and work through the triggers, work through what's activating you. And then lastly, identify and work towards achievable goals. Make sure that we're letting survivors know that, one day it may be very easy for you to use coping strategies and level yourself. But then there's going to be other days where you're going to need a little extra help. And that doesn't make you a failure. And that doesn't mean you've lost progress. It's just, once again, that plot of land is under a different condition. It's different weather in that plot of land. So we have to take a different approach. One thing that I did want to share is I have a link. I actually don't have it right now, but I will put it before we end the webinar. I have a link that will also help families emotionally safety plan with their younger children, because we really do have to think about everyone's emotional safety, right? And that's exactly what I'm going to talk about in my next slide. Don't forget the family. Helping survivors with emotional safety planning for the rest of the family will increase the way in which the family communicates as a unit. It will normalize topics of mental health. All right, so it's okay that you're having a bad day. It's okay that that you are asking for help. There should be no shame in that. It will also increase the protective factors for the children, right? We want to make sure, no matter what stage of the healing journey the survivor is in, they want to be able to give, their children and the rest of their family members an opportunity to do things that feel safe and that feel genuine. So make sure that we are safety planning emotionally for the whole family, and I'll make sure to put that link in the chat. Another thing to consider is routines, because routines can help us build resilience and healthy coping strategies. This one's hard, all right? I don't know about everyone, but I'm going to assume it's pretty hard for a majority of us. Prior to the lockdown and the pandemic, I was a mobile advocate. So that meant that at 9 a.m., I was in Phoenix. At 2 p.m., I was in Chandler. At 4 p.m., I was in Surprise. And on my way home, I could debrief and talk to my husband about my day, and then get home and just enjoy the rest of the night. I didn't have that staying home, right? So it really threw me for a loop. And it really did cause some behavioral health issues for me. And I'm sharing that because that could be the case for many of us. So we need to rethink our routines. This can also help survivors practice boundaries, right? And not just survivors, but also advocates. So something that has been recommended by quite a few counselors is to do the 10 minutes of worry a day, right? If you are trying to learn how to build a boundary, especially learn how to build a routine, and you are constantly worrying about things, find a space and for 10 minutes, make that your 10 minutes of worry or your 10 minutes of getting all that emotion out, and then go about the rest of your day. It will be hard to transition, but that also gives you the space and the time to really feel what you are feeling. Just remember that routines will be changing for everyone in the near future, right? Especially as we have a lot of people talking about going back to their offices, going back into social situations like parties, graduations, weddings. So as you are planning for your own routines and for the survivors' routines, let's make sure that we are keeping in mind how we can use these routines to build resilience, but also to provide a space to truly feel all the emotions, both positive and negative. Support networks. So just remember to help them identify emergency contacts and establish a code word with them, not just with you, the advocate or the ally, but also with their children, right? Or with other supportive adults or other supportive family members. Remember that children and other members need support in the plan too. They can be, or more likely than not, are secondary survivors. It would be very helpful in order to keep that routine and keep a boundary for you, the advocate, to explain to them their options, such as warm lines and crisis lines, and to make sure that you explain the differences between a warm line and a crisis line before you offer those numbers. And remember, of course, that ACES-TV has a helpline and that we are here to help. And then COVID-19 specific information. So sometimes some of the questions that our survivors are going to have come with, are going to be the same that we have. So do I wear a mask or do I not wear a mask? Is it safe for me to go out or is it not safe for me to go out? Well, what does the state say? It's different than the CDC, right? So while you don't have to be up to date, it is a good idea to maybe start your week or end your week looking for the latest updates to provide to the survivor. Few places that you can look for are at a state level, the Arizona Department of Health Services, at city, your local ordinances, and of course, nationally, the CDC. All right. Let's go on to virtual group facilitation, my favorite. So this is going to be breaking, but these are all good reminders, especially because what we found is that many survivors across the nation are actually really liking the virtual option. It's giving them the ability to join on a more regular basis and to have services available to them. So just a few things to keep in mind. The virtual group should be private and secure. It should involve safety planning around the tech that's going to be needed to facilitate and attend. A few things that are very helpful for everyone involved is to have a clear purpose, a clear method of moderation, and a length of time, as well as group agreements, right? It's very easy, especially if we are activated, to take control of the space that we are in, right? And that's not done on purpose, obviously, but what is the group agreement, or what do you as a moderator of that group, what are you going to do? Have you talked about it? It's always a good idea to once in a while, obviously not every meeting maybe, reiterate what the purpose of the group is, how long the group is, and the group agreements. Maybe the group agreements every single time, right? Like when you go to a training and it says, be open to learning, be respectful of everyone's comments. It's also important for our group facilitation. Other considerations, accessibility. Are you actually being accessible, and are you considering other individuals in your community, right? Maybe someone who needs ASL or who needs Spanish interpretation, if you don't have a bilingual advocate offering a group in another language. What interests the group? It's really important to know what it is that they want to learn about and talk about. Sometimes we want to learn, other times we want to share. Unstable internet connection. Hopefully you can still hear me, but it's very important that we find a balance between learning and sharing, because learning is a part of building resilience, but we're also not a school, right? We're not a college course or a non-credit course. We're also there to offer them the opportunity to heal and to share. So ask them, what are some of the things that you would like to have covered in this space? As a facilitator, know that you don't have to reinvent the wheel. There are a lot of really good topics out there, and a lot of really good group facilitators who I'm sure would be willing to help and share some of the resources that they use. And then an audience of one. There's a chance that you log in and only one person shows up. So what do? As a facilitator, you will still want to make sure that you provide that space with the same purpose and with the intention of giving them that space to share and to learn. You might have to make some adjustments to what you were going to talk about, say it was a group activity, but you still want to make sure that you give it your best, because that survivor, even if he or she is the sole survivor that attended that group, they deserve the best services. And just keep it going. It can be frustrating, it can be slightly intimidating, but just remember that this is the new normal. Include hybrids of services. Think about that in your agency. Start thinking of continuing that online support and inform yourself of other options. Sometimes capacity is the issue. So I just wanted to let you know that this website right here, which I will also put in the chat, they offer virtual support groups for different topics. So they have like a bereavement, they have teen group, and this is a great option if your agency doesn't have the capacity to let them know. There are already agencies offering groups, and here are some options. Because remember, we want to have people from all over the world, survivors from everywhere joining us. All right, let's switch course and talk about overcoming that feeling of being zoomed out, that tech fatigue, right? So before we discuss and share with each other in the chat, some of the things we've done, how we've mitigated that being zoomed out, we're going to learn about what's actually happening at a neurological level that's leading us to feeling zoomed out. So technology fatigue, because not all of us are using Zoom, right? Also known as technostress or digital fatigue, is the inability to cope with all that new technology in a healthy manner that has an impact on both your physical and mental attributes, negative impact, and that is caused by that technology. It affects all ages and all generations, even the younger people who are always on their phone. They're also feeling fatigued. So why is that? So actually, virtual interactions can be extremely hard on our brains. So during an in-person conversation, the brain focuses partly on the words that are being spoken, but it also derives additional meaning from dozens of nonverbal cues, right? Am I scribbling on my notebook? Do I keep scratching my head? Are my arms crossed and do I look defensive? Our brain is looking for all of those. And these cues help paint a holistic picture of what is being conveyed and what is expected in that interaction. So what's actually happening is that video calls like Zoom and webinars impair these ingrained abilities to understand these cues. It requires us to have an even more sustained and intense attention span to words, and that equals a brain drain. Especially when it's like multi-person function, right? Like a la Brady Bunch, like here's the story, like you see everyone. And so what's happening is that our brain is trying to decode all of those people at the same time. Someone's cat is in square 2. Someone in square 3 is arguing with someone, and someone in square 4 is working, even though I asked them not to work and pay attention. And so once again, that equals brain drain. It's happening because it's a continuous partial attention. Your brain does not understand what it's trying to focus on. What research has found is that Zoom is actually allowing people with certain learning disabilities the ability to truly focus. But for many other individuals, what's happening is, again, we're just not used to it because we're looking for those social cues. We're looking for that nonverbal communication. For some of us, this prolonged split of attention creates a perplexing sense of being drained while having accomplished absolutely nothing, right? You know, when you're like, that could have been an email, that could have been an email. That's exactly what's happening. And let's not forget about physical discomfort, right? Being in that chair for a long time, especially when it comes to adult learning. In adult learning, you're actually only supposed to be talking for 15 minutes and then giving a break. But it's just not possible all the time, especially when we're trying to cram in all this information for you, right? So it's also about that physical discomfort. And it's not just the survivors feeling fatigue, it's the advocate too. Everything is blurred. Work times. Are you staying at your desk longer than you should? Work and home space. Is there a clear division between where you are working and where you're dining or where you're spending time with your kids or your friends? Work and personal emails. It's really easy to continue to do your work email, even though you have some macaroni on the stove and or lasagna in the oven. Okay, just one more email, just while this is cooking. And then lunch and breaks. Many of us are working through our lunch and working through those breaks. We're not giving our brain the ability to replenish that sense of concentration, which is eventually going to give us that sense of accomplishment about our day. And PTO. Many of us are not taking our PTO because we have, at least until recently, you're like, I'm going to take PTO and stare out a window. I can't go anywhere or do anything, right? So why would I take my PTO? No, thank you. But that PTO is there and we should be using it and we should be taking lunch and we should be taking breaks. And I personally, our Jenna, our CEO, has this great sign in her or sentence in her email signature that says, my working hours might not be your working hours, so please do not feel pressured to reply to me right away. And I always think about that and I'm like, that is so right. Why do I feel like I need to do this instead of making sure that my beans don't burn? I should be making that boundary. So what can we do about it? For the survivor, well, this is going to overlap. For the survivors, we want to make sure that we're taking screen and media breaks. You can hide or temporarily remove apps on your phone. You don't have to delete the app. You can hide the app so it's not easy to find. I did that. I went on a digital social media break from December to February. And because it was hidden, I didn't even bother looking for it. And it gave me the break that I needed. Take inventory of what activities you can use to cope. Again, this is going to be different for every survivor. And try walking right after a meeting. Try walking after having that meeting with the advocate. Try walking after the meeting with the counselor, just to give them that space. And of course, that really sucks in certain parts of Arizona because it's so warm. But even if it's just a walk up and down the street, it's going to help us. For the advocate and the ally, take a moment to analyze your current boundaries and be honest. Are you blurring those boundaries? Are they too soft? Are you working when you shouldn't be working? Are you not taking that lunch when your body clearly needs nourishment? Address and process there's a typo, what is allowing that breach of healthy boundaries? Make sure that you can be honest with yourself. Like, what is it that's going on in my life that makes me feel that I have to be on call 24/7? You, the advocate and ally, take inventory of what activities you can use to cope. Take extemporary or extended media and social media and general media breaks. You don't have to watch the news every night, unless you're like me and you wake up and you do listen to NPR while doing your makeup. But do you know when to stop and just say, you know, today I'm listening to music? And find your support network. Survivors are not the only ones that need a support network. So it's very important that we also identify a lot of the things that we're asking our survivors to identify, because we need to take care of ourselves as well. All right, with that, I'm going to turn it over to Marley.
Thank you, Lizette. Let me just share my screen quick. Awesome. So now we're going to move on to understanding what active listening looks like in the virtual space. So I think we as advocates, as folks who do this work, understand the role and the importance of active listening, but probably also understand the barrier that exists in the virtual space to be mindful of and provide that active listening. So we'll break that down here. So kind of to prepare ourselves, how are we being mindful of and avoiding distractions, right? We know that these are inevitable. I constantly and consistently have my dogs kind of barking in the background, which is a distraction I have to be mindful of. And I think that's an important first step. How are we aware of those distractions and how are we understanding of that, right? We're working from home. This isn't always ideal for those of us who are still kind of balancing that. And so there are things that we can do, like ensuring that our physical space limits those distractions. So how are we kind of creating a space that limits those distractions and allows us to really focus on what we're doing? Avoiding multitasking. I know this is a really big one that I struggle with. I think it's really easy. Perhaps some of us, even in trainings or in staff meetings or other kind of group settings, think that it's maybe easy to send a quick email, follow up, schedule something. And I think that's something we want to be mindful of, trying to limit as much as possible. So avoiding that multitasking. And that can look like closing unnecessary windows or tabs, right? Really making sure not only our physical space kind of at our desk or wherever we're working is free of distractions, but also just literally our computer screen. How are we kind of taking an inventory of that regularly and limiting those distractions on our computer? Additionally, I think becoming familiar with things like do not disturb settings and those alert notifications on our devices is something that we can be mindful of when we think of limiting those distractions. And then taking a few minutes before a video meeting to prepare. I don't know if you all have found yourselves in this situation, but I know I've been kind of running a couple minutes late, had to quickly kind of jump on a video, and really I don't feel kind of prepared and like I've set myself up for success prior to entering that video call. So how are we being mindful of and kind of factoring into those meetings, taking those few minutes before to prepare? I think being in the virtual space, I know for me, just in terms of scheduling and coordinating, it's been really easy to do kind of meetings back to back to back. And it really doesn't allow me to take those couple minutes for myself, to check in with myself, see if I need to disconnect for a little bit, you know, have a snack, whatever those things are that I need. And so while it's convenient to be able to coordinate things kind of close to other commitments that we have, we really want to be mindful of taking those minutes in between to prepare for ourselves and be mindful of that multitasking as well. So then how are we creating space in the virtual setting? So do your part to create an open and safe space that encourages participation. So this could be with a colleague, this could be with a client. We want to acknowledge and honor input and questions from everyone. And so, you know, I think we can maybe reflect on our own experiences of being in a meeting or a space virtually where, you know, it was easy to kind of dominate. And so how are we being mindful of the space that we're creating in those interactions and allowing input from everyone, regardless if they have their camera on, right? Honoring folks' comfort level means acknowledging that not everyone perhaps feels comfortable being on camera. And so how are we being mindful of encouraging communication in the chat, understanding that if our goal is really to get clients, to get participants to be engaged in this space in a virtual meeting, how are we adjusting maybe to their comfort level and providing that space for folks? When it comes to communication, how are we making video calls as interactive as possible, right? I think it's really easy to kind of check out if there's not that interactivity there. You might notice, just on our end, we provided that Menti kind of interactive activity right from the beginning of our training to really encourage that interaction. So what are some of those platforms, whether it's things like Menti that we used, Padlet, there's a variety of tools and kind of online interactive ways to encourage that interactivity. And we can be sure to include some of those resources in our follow-up to you all, just so you're aware. But we know we're going to get more interaction and engagement when we have those ways to be interactive. We want to, just like we would perhaps in person, ask those clarifying questions to ensure understanding. I think in the virtual space, there's even greater room for miscommunication, right? Or internet going out, or any one of those distractions, perhaps hindering us from understanding. And so being mindful of asking those clarifying questions accordingly. And then lastly, we want to provide reassurance that what the person we're interacting with is sharing is important, and that we're listening through things like nonverbal communication, affirming body language. I think something I've come to find is the way that I come off or perhaps appear on a video call is maybe not always how I'm feeling, right? And so I think we're limited in how we're being interpreted in these video calls. And so providing that extra reassurance, being mindful of our nonverbal communication is really important. And let me just check the chat here quick. Oh, cool. Lizette's sharing some of those resources. So looking at nonverbal communication, I want us to especially pay attention to this, as this is kind of the activity we're going to do here in a little bit. So really, what does that nonverbal communication look like for you all? Is it maintaining that eye contact, really being aware of our posture and kind of what we're communicating? Considering things like what's in our background, right? And what does that communicate? Are we familiar with options to blur our background or potentially use a photo as our background? If we're limited in how we can kind of change what our background looks like. And we want to be sure we're signaling affirmation through head nods, hand gestures, and facial expressions. I know I think it can sometimes feel over the top to provide that affirmation, but I think it goes a long way in the virtual space. And so how are we kind of being mindful of those forms of nonverbal communication and what that's communicating? I know a big learning curve for us, especially kind of in this training setting, is getting comfortable with silence, right? So in allowing that time for folks to process and share. So asking for input and then really being intentionally patient for that response while continuing to provide our full attention. I think this has been a lesson in patience really overall. And so another step of that is really just ensuring that folks are familiar with the different virtual platforms. In the beginning, we shared the wide variety of virtual platforms we've been using and getting familiar with in this last year. And so how are we ensuring, even if we might have learned those different platforms, how are we ensuring the folks that we're working with are familiar with those platforms, are familiar with those settings? I included this graphic here of you're on mute because I think folks have joked, this is kind of the catchphrase of this virtual work from home space, right? How many times have you been in a meeting yourself where the person is sharing and, oh, they're on mute? But we have to genuinely be understanding of, like I said, the learning curve that exists for folks. And so something that we do here at the Coalition when we start trainings is we, as it relates to the Zoom setting, because that's the platform that we kind of use most consistently, we really spell out and make clear to folks, what they can expect. So we shared this image from some of our folks here at the Coalition, but just kind of the basics of the options that they have at the bottom of their screen. Make sure they understand kind of the mute button, the stop or start video button, participants, really understanding who all is on this call, right? That could be a really valid concern for folks, of just not having that awareness of, well, who all is existing in this virtual space with me? Making sure folks are familiar with things like the chat. And so we kind of break down the chat for folks further. So making sure they understand that they can click everyone when they're sending a message, or they can send a message to a particular person. So really, like I said, we might have really learned and feel like we've mastered these tools and this platform, but how are we ensuring folks who don't get to use these platforms as often understand it as well? And I think that option there of who we send those messages to can be a big one. Also kind of highlighting things like this, right? Reactions that folks can share, really feeling like they're interactive. I think especially for folks who maybe don't feel as comfortable having their video on, but really want to still feel like they can participate in that communication, being aware of reactions and the way that they can communicate in that capacity is really important. And so you can kind of see, we highlighted those reactions at the bottom. And then this is helpful for us, especially since we're going to do breakout rooms in just a little bit, but making sure folks understand if you are, in a setting where you have breakout rooms, that folks understand things like how much time they have left, right, in the upper right, that they know there's an option to ask for help, and that they know there's an option to leave the room. How are we making clear and informing folks of these options on all the different platforms? And then another option with Zoom and these different platforms is sharing that information, sharing documents. So making sure folks are aware of those features as well. There's a lot of tools on these platforms that can be really useful when we're providing services, but they're not going to be useful, right, if folks don't understand how those work. And so I think it's a matter of us as advocates, as people doing this work, being mindful of those capabilities, and then really ensuring that it's accessible and we're making that information available to the folks we're serving. Cool. And then I think Lizette probably already went over some of this, but I think, it's so important for us to learn how to navigate these shorter attention spans because of this Zoom and tech fatigue. And so these are some things that I think have worked well for me that I think perhaps could work well for you. So for me, when I'm logging on and kind of preparing for my day, I have a little ritual that really helps me settle into work. And so for me, I'm kind of like a geography nerd. And so for me, that little ritual looks like I go to this website that has this kind of interactive, like, naming countries game. That's like a thing I've tried to master in quarantine, how I can name all 197 countries of the world. And so that just kind of gets me in the zone, gets me in the virtual space, allows me to work kind of productively and under a kind of time limit. I think there's like 15 minutes. I can share that link for anyone else who is interested. But it's just one of those little little rituals on the virtual platform that allows me to kind of concentrate, settle into work. And if I have a good day and I name a lot of the countries, it's even a better note, right? So what do those little rituals look like for you all? I know for me, because of kind of short attention span and balancing so many different things, really leaning into the use of sticky notes and to-do lists has worked really well for me. And also, if you all have things that have worked really well for you, please feel free to share that in a chat. I really want us to kind of find community in navigating this virtual space together and see how things that have worked well for one of us can perhaps work well for another person. And so another kind of component of navigating those shorter attention spans and remaining concentrated is staying hydrated. So there was a study done at the University of Barcelona that actually found that mild dehydration, something as little as 2%, can negatively impact our ability to concentrate. So how are we staying hydrated? When we're kind of creating our physical space around us, how are we making sure we have, you know, a hydro flask, a water bottle nearby to kind of stay hydrated and help us focus? And then going back to making video calls as interactive as possible. I think this really helps us with our communication, our engagement, and limits the likelihood of us checking or responding to that email because we're really engaged in what's happening in that video call. Let me just check the chat here. So we have a question here: to-do lists on the computer, sticky notes on paper or computer. So I know there are actually some platforms where you can have kind of to-do lists on the computer. I know of Padlet as one of those, and that's also one that can be interactive. So perhaps you're working on a project with folks and you're wanting to kind of communicate in that space. But like I said, we'll be sure to share those resources and those links. But yeah, when I was talking about to-do lists, I meant like just kind of your own to-do list to help navigate shorter attention spans right now. And so yeah, the name of the website that I'm referencing is Padlet. I think it's spelled like this, but I'll be sure to include it in the email to you all, padlet.com. So that's definitely a cool resource for keeping those notes, those to-do lists in the virtual space. And like I said, if folks have other things that have been working well for them to kind of stay concentrated or have any of those little rituals that are useful, please feel free to share. I think the way that we navigate this time is by learning together and really creating that community. And so we want to hear from you all of what's working and what maybe isn't working as we continue to navigate this space. And Lizette, I'm going to turn it back over to you to talk about comparative suffering. And then just so folks are aware, we're going to have an activity after this with this learning of kind of the nonverbal communication and this part that Lizette's about to share. And Lizette, I don't know if you're sharing yet, but on my end, you're on mute.
Yes, thank you. See, just exactly what we talked about. It happens even to the best of us, right? So comparative suffering is when we feel that our experiences are not as bad as the experiences of others. So my pain doesn't matter as much as yours does. And I'm having quick tech issues, sorry about that. All right, there we go. So what does comparative suffering look like and why is it important that we learn about it today? So comparative suffering usually starts with at least, should, and but. And we're doing it, all of us are doing it as a whole, as a community, not just survivors, advocates and allies are as well. And here are the dangers of this comparative suffering language, at least. While some see this as a silver lining approach or a glass half full, it can be very invalidating. Well, at least you still have a job, right? At least you didn't lose all your income. And it's really invalidating the actual suffering, the pain, or the turmoil that could be happening for the survivor or for the advocate. Should. The word should is inherently one that brings shame, guilt, and blame, and it's definitely one we have to be very aware of, especially in the movement to end violence. Because if you think about both domestic and sexual violence, there are a lot of should statements that are used to re-victimize. You should have left. You should have gotten help. Well, you should have or you could have. And so a lot of that language is very shaming. It's going to bring guilt. And a lot of those statements are also going to keep the survivor feeling that what they're feeling is invalid, that their experiences are not equal to those of others who have suffered more greatly. That also goes for the advocate, right? I shouldn't feel like this. I should be able to keep working. I am the helper. I shouldn't need help. I should be okay. My ducks should be in a row, not at a rave, right? And then but. But is a word that essentially functions to cross out whatever came before it and invalidate it. So think about, I'm feeling really sad, but I really should be grateful that at least A, B, or C. All right, so it really, all of these words and all of these statements, what they're doing is comparing your suffering and your situation to that of others. And what you're doing there, both either if you're the survivor or the advocate, is not giving yourself grace and the opportunity to go through those stages of grief and through those stages of understanding what the situation is and what is happening.
Lizette, can you?
Yes, I see that I cut out for a second.
Yeah, I think you cut out just your last kind of bit there. If you don't mind going over that once again, I think that would be helpful for folks.
Oh, so somebody says you cut out and it's playing fast catch up. Oh no, I was saying to avoid, as we really should be mindful of this comparative suffering language because we are invalidating our feelings, our experiences, and we're also not giving ourselves the space to grieve and to understand what we are feeling and to be able to also share that with our support network because we don't want to. Are we going to share if you're like, well, at least so-and-so, but I'm okay. So no, I'm not going to share. Okay, I'm going to take a quick pause here. I see that I'm cutting it out again. So hopefully, I set my device to priority, so hopefully that helps.
Yeah, you're sounding great now, Lizette.
Okay, so a few more examples about this comparative suffering language and how we're using it, especially this year with the pandemic. Well, at least I still have a job. Many do not have a job because they were let go because of the pandemic. How can I complain or feel bored being confined to my house when there are so many people that don't have a place to stay? All those homeless people, where did they quarantine? What, you know, I shouldn't even be bored. I shouldn't even complain because I actually have I can watch TV, I can watch Netflix. Why am I feeling this way? Well, others just have it worse. In general, they just have it worse. I shouldn't feel this way. I'm the expert. I'm the advocate. I should be okay because others need me to be okay. I really shouldn't feel so anxious or scared. My neighbor, family, member, friend is immunocompromised and I'm healthy, so there's no logical reason for my fear. And this last one, I really wanted to pay extra attention to because we are going to start venturing out. And how is it going to feel after a year walking into Target and not having to wear a mask? There's going to be some fear and some anxieties for all of us. And so what is going to happen is we might start using this comparative suffering language to invalidate those feelings and those experiences that we are going to have. Be mindful and practice grace with yourself. It is okay for you to feel what you feel, and it is okay for you to be scared of the unknown. It's part of the collective human nature, right? To be scared of the unknown. Remember that helpers need help. It is completely okay that you, the advocate, need the time to think about what comparative language you're using, because it's going to translate to the services that you are offering. If you have that at least, that but, that should, are you going to start a semblance of transference to the client, to the survivor that you are working with, and maybe lose some of that empathy, some of that understanding that you have always been known for as an advocate? So not only is it going to affect you, it's also going to affect the survivors, the communities that we service, and even our families, because it could also lead to a sense of burnout or fatigue, which Marley is going to be talking some more about. I apologize that I was cutting out in this section, but I hope that everyone still understood the basics of comparative suffering. I also want you all to know that I'll be putting into the chat our group activities and self-care PDF that has a section where you can jot down notes on how to best care for yourself, and also has some ideas and activities for self-care. Marley?
Awesome, thank you, Lizette. And so I'll just quickly share my screen. And so next step is we're going to kind of walk through the activity that we're about to do. So now that we, learned, we got familiar with some of the examples of nonverbal communication in the virtual space, right? Eye contact, affirming body language, being aware of our posture. And because Lizette kind of explained to us what comparative suffering looks like, we're going to do an activity that hopefully kind of combines the two. So this is really nonverbal communication practice. And I'll kind of explain this, and then we're going to go out into breakout rooms in just a moment. And so the way that this is going to work is we'll be in breakout rooms with 3 folks to a room. And so you'll rotate being the speaker, the listener, and the observer. And some folks might be familiar with this activity if you've been to some of our other trainings, but we kind of have a twist on it. It's going to be a little bit different. And so the way that this is going to work is the speaker is going to share a non-traumatic story with the intent of evoking emotion. And so we want to be really mindful in sharing this story, that we don't want it to be a traumatic story. We don't want it to be anything that triggers folks. So an example, I might share a story of a few years ago, I broke my wrist and I was feeling really overwhelmed with kind of what to do next. It was kind of it made me really aware of being an adult and kind of having to make these decisions as far as healthcare, what I was going to do, what kind of support services I needed as a result, navigating kind of insurance and bills in that capacity, right? A lot of feelings of overwhelm at navigating that experience. And so, like I said, I hope that was an example in showing what a non-traumatic kind of story can be like, but a story that allows you to share how you were feeling, some of the emotions you were experiencing during that time. So go ahead and kind of think of what your story might be. So while the speaker is sharing, the listener is just going to remain muted and provide nonverbal emotional validation to the speaker. So the listener must remain muted the entire time. You're not going to unmute to share anything, but you're just going to be really mindful of what are those nonverbal cues. What does that nonverbal communication look like that affirms what that speaker is sharing? And then the third person in those rooms is going to be the observer. So they're going to take notes of what the listener is doing, what those nonverbal forms of communication look like, perhaps how the speaker is responding to those nonverbal communications, if that allows them to feel more comfortable in sharing or not. And the goal is everyone should take a turn being the listener. Does anyone have any questions on that before we do breakout rooms? Let me just open up the chat. Cool, I don't see any yet. And so when you're in this space, obviously our goal here is for folks to be have their videos on, right? You want to be able to hear from that speaker and see the way they're communicating, and then really be able to observe the way that the listener is providing that nonverbal emotional feedback. And especially based with what we just learned from Lizette as it relates to comparative suffering. When you're listening to this speaker, how are you being mindful of that comparative suffering? So how are you being mindful of comparing the story that you're sharing with the story that they're sharing? Notice if you see examples of that kind of creep up, of feeling like your story perhaps isn't as valid compared to the story that's being shared. Does that kind of make sense for folks? Do we have to have video to participate? So ideally, to be able to do that listening option of providing that nonverbal emotional support to the person, we would want folks to have videos on, but no worries if you're not able to or don't feel comfortable. I think even just being in that space, seeing the other folks in your breakout rooms participate will be useful. Okay, cool. So kind of have your story ready to share. I'm going to go ahead and figure out breakout rooms. So just be patient with me. Lizette, I don't know if we need to stop recording now.
Yes, everyone, I'm going to pause recording and I'm actually going to open all rooms right now. You will see an invitation to join your breakout room.
Those are off and recognize, especially when I show you all stage 4 in this next slide, the way that this progressively causes more and more harm. And so hopefully the goal of understanding the different stages allows us to recognize those symptoms early and do something about that, have that communication with the folks we're working with, decide how we can figure out our capacity and our caseload, have those communications with our team. So looking at this final stage of burnout, so compounded symptoms from previous stages, right? This could look like uncontrolled crying spells, not having a lot of control over it, it just kind of coming all out, feeling agitated, perhaps having a lowered self-esteem. We might feel like we need to over-reason to emotional stimuli. There might be kind of constant feelings of tension. Accidental carelessness, right? We're just not able to focus as much. And so there might be those accidental examples of carelessness and kind of an increased feeling of hostility, whether it's towards the folks we work with, the folks in our home, the folks that we're serving. And so, like I said, I hope that this information and understanding those stages empowers us to recognize these things. I think in this role, we're often so good at supporting and providing that support to others that, we don't always look out and support ourselves. And I think in this work, there's a lot more of this kind of power through mentality. But we know that powering through, can lead us to these more harmful stages of burnout. And so we were going to do an activity where we were going to kind of recognize where we are on these stages if we are feeling burnout, but I think that's for us to really reflect on and marinate on and kind of work on accordingly. And just having that context of how the virtual space makes this all the more challenging. Let me check the chat quick. Cool. And so now ways that we can combat that burnout are self-care, right? So how are we taking care of ourselves in the future? And so I don't know if we have time for this activity today, but I'm going to kind of provide the directions for it so that you all can do this activity kind of on your own at home in preparation for how are we taking care of our future self? Sometimes we're not taking care of our future self. I think there's like a meme or a joke of like, when I know I have a meeting the next day and I say I'm just going to fill up my gas tank in the morning, right? That's not really taking care of future self. That means future self next day has to get up extra early and make sure I have my gas ready for that meeting. And so we instead want to think, how are we really setting ourselves up for success in the future? Because we know that this is hard work. And so what this activity involves is creating self-compassion cards. And so, like I said, I'm going to go through how we do this, and you all will have this information emailed out to you to refer back to, but just kind of be thinking of how you might work on this activity yourself and how future self will appreciate you doing that. So self-compassion cards require a couple index cards. It's totally up to you how many you want to create. I said like maybe 10 to 15. So you'll just need 10 to 15 of those cards and then something to write with. And so the way that it works is on each of those index cards, you're going to write a self-compassion prompt to be responded to at a later date. And like I said, this is really one of those proactive forms of self-care. And so I would argue this is kind of more than an affirmation like we see on the screen, right? Some of the examples, I am worthy of wonderful things in my life. No matter what I've said or done, I am a lovable person. I think affirmations are really good and important, but I think the cool thing about these cards is they're interactive. And so you have this prompt that you actually have to respond to. And so the way that it works, it's a two-part activity. So part one is just creating those cards. And that's something that you can do like now in the moment when you're feeling good for your future self. And so some of the questions you might write on those cards include, what is something you're especially proud of? What do you receive the most compliments about? What are 3 things that you love about yourself? Or what is the quality you are proud of in yourself? And I think this can relate to the work that we do, or it can just relate to you as a person, right? This activity is however is going to be most affirming and kind of supportive of you. And so Lizette has kind of an example right here. I don't need to justify needing to slow down. Remember, that's one of Lizette's cards. So think of like, what are some of those questions you might write on those cards to kind of prompt you to answer later? That's kind of part one of this activity. And then part two is, recognizing you're in a setting, you're feeling down, maybe you have some of those early stages of burnout, and you really need those affirmations to feel good and to keep going. And so part two is responding to those cards. And you can respond in whatever way feels best for you. You can respond to the cards aloud, so just reading the response out loud. You can write a response, or you can share your response with someone else, right? Share it with your partner, your kids, someone in your home, your colleague, perhaps. I think normalizing in the workspace, us affirming and supporting those affirmations is really important. And so you want to save these cards for the days in which future you could really benefit from that self-care and that affirmative message. So you want to do part one of writing those kind of 10 to 15 prompts when you're feeling good, when future you would thank you for that. And then part two is kind of having those cards handy for when you need them and when you need to be reminded of things you're great at. What are those compliments you receive? And you just are in need of kind of feeling good. Does that activity kind of make sense for folks? I hope that it's useful for folks. I know this is something that I plan to do, and this can be part of, like we said, creating our physical environment, having those cards handy, knowing where they are, and knowing that we can respond to those. Cool. And if anyone has any ideas for prompts that they think would be good or would help them, their future self, feel free to share those in the chat as well. Awesome. So that's kind of what we're rounding out today's training with. I appreciate you all so much for being so interactive, for participating in our breakout room activity. And so now we want to see if folks have any questions before we kind of close out. And so it doesn't look like I'm seeing any questions, but feel free to ask us or reach out to us. And then lastly, I think Lizette just shared the evaluation link in the chat. So we really appreciate you all participating in that, letting us know what worked, where there are opportunity areas, whatever kind of works for you all. We appreciate you all being here.
Yes, and thank you for our interpreters for being patient with us as we are navigating the ever-changing virtual webinar meeting technology, all of that. We appreciate each and every single one of you, and we appreciate our interpreters.
Absolutely. Thank you, Lizette. And so just a reminder, we'll be sending out all this information to registrants. So be on the lookout for that. And once you've completed the evaluation, you are free to go. So have a great rest of your day. Have a great week. I hope you all are taking care of yourselves. And we'll see you at our next training.